by the way, this is Coco. He decided to join me for today's lecture, which is actually quite suitable because my thesis, I was writing a multi-species history. So now we're having a multi-species lecture. Yeah, as Kat introduced, I just recently finished my PhD thesis on histories of non-human animal experimentation in the Netherlands. And in that, I focused a lot on how the experiences of individual animals changed over time during different historical periods. But for today, I'm mostly focusing on the 3 R's and what lessons about the 3 R's we can learn from the historical cases that I looked at. So the lecture will have the following topics. First, I will give a brief history of the 3 R's, and then I will look at 2 case studies and see what the barriers have been in those case studies to the uptake of the 3 R's. Then we will look at the iceberg. I will explain what it is when we get there and look at some examples of opportunities for change using the iceberg. And then finally, there will be some conclusions and reflections. And the reason we're doing this is because I think we all agree that ideally science would not use non-human animals to get their research results. You know, ideally we wouldn't do that. And we have had this idea for many decades already, but we are still using lots and lots of animals in science. So maybe if we look at the history, we can get some idea about what has been blocking this transition away from animal science and what have been opportunities that we can build on in the future. Yeah. So for a brief history of the 3 R's, the 3 R's, I assume you all know that they are replacement, reduction, and refinement. They were first introduced by Russell and Burch in their book, The Principles of Humane Experimental Techniques, already in 1959, so a pretty long time ago. And they weren't immediately the success that they are now. So I think now everyone that works in animal experimentation is familiar with the 3 R's, and students learn about them during their training. But when they were first introduced, it actually took about 20 years before they caught on and became widely popular. So when we look at the time period around 1959, 3 R's and alternatives were not a big issue yet. But what you do see during that time period is that care for laboratory animals becomes more important. And that has to do with the idea of healthy animals lead to better research, better science. So it's a very instrumental perspective on care. And the focus is on hygiene and preventing diseases. And of course, you also have already a bit earlier in the 20th century, the idea of standardization and trying to control the breeding of animals to get as much control over the research instrument as possible. But it's very much an instrumental perspective of getting the best scientific results, and also a financial perspective, because if a lot of your animals die from unknown diseases, then of course that's also an economic loss. This changes in the next period. And so, yeah, the periodization is based on the Netherlands. It could be that it's a bit different in different countries, but overall, I think you see a similar trend. And this is also reflected in the images that you see. So in the previous slide, you saw an image of a rabbit cage from 1950, and then at the same institute in 1994, you can see the difference. And you can also see that this is no longer about just preventing diseases, but the idea of care broadens to include welfare, also just feeling good, having social relations, social housing, having something to do. So as I was saying, the care has now become much broader than just preventing diseases, and it also has become a moral duty. So even if promoting the welfare of laboratory animals is not directly benefiting humans, it's still seen as a moral duty to care for them as well as possible within the context of the laboratory. So not so much care that you say, okay, then we don't experiment on animals, because that would be the ultimate way to care for them, of course. Yeah, and regarding the 3 R's, you can see they become popular within science, but also within policy. So you get governments creating policy explicitly to promote the use of alternatives and also allocating some budget to that. You see national centers for alternatives, and also within institutes, coordination points for alternatives. And in the beginning, there was a bit of the language of there is a trade-off between alternatives and science, so a trade-off between animal welfare or even animal rights and science, but then that changes into a win-win perspective. So the idea that alternatives are good for humans as well as animals, because we only call something an alternative when it's better science than the animal test. So as long as we focus on alternatives, then everybody wins, is the idea. And then we also see that many countries by this time have animal testing legislation that also says that you can only use animals if there's no non-animal alternative available. And then this popularization of the 3 R's continues until present time, I think. I think in most countries the 3 R's are still the dominant paradigm, and also during this time more and more institutes and universities develop things like 3 R's centers. But there is a bit of a shift in focus, or a rather a broadening of focus. So it's not just about developing those alternatives, because what people experience is that, well, even if you develop an alternative, it's not enough, because you also need people to use that alternative and regulators to approve the alternative. And also you want the alternative to be validated internationally, because let's say you want to bring a product onto the market and you want to test it using an alternative, safety test it, for example, but that test is only accepted in a few countries, then there's no point in doing it, because then you still need to do the animal test for other countries. So that is why there was more and more focus also on harmonization, validation, and implementation. And more recently, there have also been some more critical perspectives towards the 3 R's, saying, should we maybe only focus on replacement and not reduction and refinement, or should we move completely beyond the 3 R's, because even the idea of replacement is too much departing from the animal tests, instead of thinking, well, what can we do, starting to think with human biology as the basis and not an animal test that we did in the past. And the reason for this is that if you look at the numbers, for example, the graph shows the numbers for the Netherlands, you can see that when registration of animal testing started in 1980, there's quite a steep drop, but then in the 1990s, animal use stabilizes. And that's interesting, because the 3 R's policy and alternatives, they also started around the 1980s, and of course they were not going to have such a fast effect on the numbers, because it takes a few years, often it takes about 10 years for an alternative to be developed and then validated and then implemented. So it seems that the first drop in animal use is actually more down to the registration effect. So similar to when you're asked to write down what you're eating, for example, then probably you will also eat less candy or less junk food, because you're having to write it down. So just people look more critically at the animals they're using when they're asked to register them. And that seems a more likely explanation than that there were all kinds of alternatives developed within just 1 year. And then another trend, what you see is that when the transgenic techniques are being developed from the 1990s onward, you also get more and more animals that are killed in stock, as they say. So they are produced in the transgenic breeding process, but they don't have the right genotype, so they aren't used. And then if you were to add those numbers, then you would actually get an increase in animals killed for animal testing. So then the question comes up, do we need to rethink those 3 R's, or maybe look at one of the R's, or have a whole new different paradigm. So that is where we are now. And we will now look at two case studies. The first one is about the polio monkeys. And within those case studies, we will also see some of the more general developments that I was just sketching. Yeah, so I assume you all know the polio vaccine. And yeah, there was a bit of a race to create the first polio vaccine in the first half of the 20th century, when there were more and more polio outbreaks everywhere, including in the Netherlands. So when there were finally vaccines available, of course, the Netherlands also wanted to vaccinate their children. And the RIVM, the National Institute for Public Health and Environment, where I did my research, and they were responsible for polio vaccine production in the Netherlands. And polio can only be contracted by primates. So for growing the virus, they needed a substrate from a primate species. And for that, they used monkeys, cynomolgus monkeys in the case of the RIVM. And in the beginning, they used about 5,000 monkeys per year, just for the Dutch production. And those were imported from the wild. So they were free-living monkeys that were then transported to the Netherlands. And of course, you can imagine that this is quite an undertaking. They weren't using monkeys at such a large scale before. And it's also expensive. And a lot of those monkeys died because of infections and the stress of transportation. So they were highly motivated to reduce the number of monkeys used. And what is interesting, referring to the developments I discussed before, is that at first this was purely an economic thing and human safety thing, because you also don't want infections to spread to humans, and a monkey scarcity thing. But then in the 1980s, you see all of a sudden a change in the discourse around the reduction of monkeys used, and then they say, well, for ethical reasons, we want to reduce the use of monkeys. So all of a sudden, ethics becomes part of the talking about reduction. And they were quite successful at reducing monkey use. So it went from 5,000 and then to 500 to 50, and in the end, about 5 to 10 monkeys per year. And that also gave them the opportunity to breed the monkeys at their own premises. And they did this in groups, in harem groups. And you can see an example in the picture. And they used social housing and refined housing. And then in the end, the monkeys were replaced by a continuous cell line. But that did not happen until the beginning of this century. And this is the interesting part, because the RIVM worked together with the Mérieux Institute in France to develop this continuous cell line based vaccine. And this was already possible in 1982. And actually the Mérieux Institute started using it also in the early 1980s. But the RIVM did not. Not for 20 years. And they refrained from making the switch to the continuous cell line. And of course, that got me wondering, like, what is going on here? Why did you not use the cell line much earlier? And when I looked in the archives, I saw in all the meetings for those 20 years saying, oh, the continuous cell line is really promising. We expect that very soon, in a few years, we will have switched to the cell line. And at some point, they had even sold all their monkeys because they thought, oh, next year we'll switch to the continuous cell line. But every time it didn't happen. And I also saw a bit in the archives that, there was concern about the cell line and if it would lead to tumor. So if it would be tumor-genetic in the long run in using it in a vaccine, even though they had done all the tests that showed that it wouldn't be, but there was still some concern. But wasn't really clear to me what it was based on. And there was also a bit of a lack of urgency, because they said, oh, well, we're only using 5 monkeys per year now, so it's not so urgent. But in the end, what finally pushed them over the edge of making the switch was that there was an infection among the monkeys. And by that time, it would also have been really difficult to acquire new monkeys because a lot of airlines weren't transporting monkeys anymore. And there was also an animal ethics committee really pushing them to finally make the switch to the continuous cell line. So if we now look at that case study through a sort of transition perspective of what were the barriers in this case, first we look at refinement. So you see the nice cage here with the group housing, but they didn't always live in such nice cages, and that had to do for one part with the budget. So they had done some studies saying, oh, they really like the bigger cages and the shared housing, but we don't have the budget to buy the bigger cages for all the monkeys. And another reason was infections, because in group housing, the monkeys are also more prone to infect one another. They had issues with foamy virus and later with polyoma virus. And then they reverted back to individual housing. So those were barriers for the refinement. And then for the replacement, we can see risk aversion. So the idea that, well, we use the monkeys now and it seems to work, so why switch? Because when we switch, there is a risk, even if it's very small. And why would we take the risk if it's fine the way it's going now? And then by the end, when they did switch, already 60 other countries had made the switch, so they couldn't really argue that anymore. And then there's regulations. So this is also mostly for the beginning of when they technically could have made the switch, but they were exporting to various different countries. So that would mean having to re-register the polio vaccine based on the continuous cell line in all those different countries and deal with the regulatory authorities in those countries. And finally, attitudes towards animal use, because they said, well, it's only 5 monkeys per year, so we don't really feel the urgency. That says something about how you think about monkeys and other animals in general. If we had cared like super much about monkeys, then even 5 monkeys would have been a very strong motivation to make that switch right away when it was possible to the continuous cell line. And I've pointed out these barriers to replacement because they are ones that are also found in many other case studies and literature in general, and as we will see also in the next case. So this is about mice, XPA mice. XPA comes from xeroderma pigmentosa group A. The details are not so important, but this is a mouse where this XPA gene is knocked out so that the mouse is more prone to develop tumors when exposed to carcinogens. And the thinking behind this was that for carcinogenicity testing, you had to do a chronic bioassay in a rat and a mouse. And what if we use more sensitive mice? And then maybe we will need to use less mice and also have a shorter duration of the assay. So in this case, the mouse is actually the alternative to other mice. And there was a big international research program with XPA mice and also XPA P53 because they found the cross was even better than just XPA. And also I think there was a hamster involved to see if they could replace the standard mouse bioassay. And the results were promising, and FDA approved the test, though not necessarily as always a replacement, but at least approved in the sense that it was acknowledged that it could contribute to carcinogenicity testing in certain circumstances. But in the end, the XPA mice were never used in regulatory carcinogenicity testing, and they ended up frozen, like the last mice are frozen in a repository in the US. So then the question is, of course, why were they not used? And one of the issues specifically with the XPA-P53 transgenic cross is again the budget, because a double transgenic mouse is quite expensive, because you can only use a few of them and you have a lot of that are left over and killed in stock. And there were other transgenic mice in the program that were comparable but cheaper because they were single transgenic. And there were also issues with patenting, because there was a company that owned part of the construct they used for developing the mouse, and they got into an argument with them, not finding agreement about the right to produce the mouse at a large scale, and they never resolved that. Yeah, so those were important reasons for why the mouse was never used. But more interesting, I think, for us now is the idea of the mouse chronic bioassay requirement in the first place, because already when they were starting this alternative search for an alternative, people in industry were saying, but we don't even need a chronic bioassay in the first place, because it doesn't give us any relevant information in most cases on top of other tests that are already being conducted. And so then the question was, well, why do you do it? Well, because regulation requires it. And why does regulation require it? Well, just to be safe. Because at one point we thought it would be a good idea and we don't just want to skip it. So basically what they were doing is they were finding an alternative for something that had very little value in the first place. And in later years, more recent years, they have started to use calculations based on other shorter tests, and only in very limited cases, those calculations then lead to the mouse bioassay, and other times it is just waived. And then so I asked one of the people I interviewed, I asked, well, could they not have made those calculations back when they started this research program? And he said, well, yeah, but back then nobody really cared about a few hundred or thousand mice, more or less. So that those are, again, the human attitudes towards other animals, mice in this case. So you see quite similar barriers actually in both cases. And then now I would like to introduce you to the iceberg. So the iceberg is developed by Mani and Kavana, and it comes from systems thinking and systems dynamic, and it can help you think about complex transitions. So it is often said that the transition in animal testing and transition away from animal testing is a wicked problem. So a problem that has a lot of different aspects and interrelations and a lot of conflicting interests and stakeholders, and it's difficult to see what you have to do to make that transition. And the iceberg is a model that can help you think about that. And the idea of the iceberg is that you have events that you see, but below that you have multiple deeper layers that affect what events you see. So it is, when you want to transition, it is not enough to just address the events, but you need to address all the layers of the iceberg for a true transformation. So to give an example from the case studies we just had, let's say the event is, we don't have budget for bigger cages for the monkeys. You can call that an event. And then an underlying pattern could be that there are budget shortages for 3Rs. So there's not enough budget in general for refinement, but also maybe for all the 3Rs. That would be a pattern. And then underneath that, you would have the financing structure. So how science is financed from government or within industry, and that then lead to those budget shortages. And then below that, you have what are called mental models. So those are beliefs and values, things like that. So there you could have what we saw already twice, human attitudes towards non-human animals. So the idea is that if those attitudes would change, let's say we would value mice as much as we would value humans, then of course that would also lead us to restructure our finances and maybe not even finance research that uses mice anymore. And so you can see how different layers of the iceberg can affect one another. And then let's look at the underlying beliefs that we've seen in the case studies that work together to sort of stand in the way of the transition. One is that risks should be avoided at all costs. Like risk aversion is a barrier, and that's very often identified in all kinds of case studies. But that is combined with the belief that animal test is the golden standard. You know, risk aversion in itself is not necessarily always a barrier to moving away from animal testing, but it is when it is combined with the idea that animal testing is the gold standard and that not doing a certain animal test anymore will entail more risk than when you do it, instead of thinking that the risks are different, but not necessarily more when you change the way you do research. And then there is also humans are more important than other animals. And I've put other between parentheses because I would say other animals. You know, I would say humans are also a species of animals. But there is quite a hardcore belief also in society that humans are not animals. And you could even say that that even underlies this belief that you first have the separation of humans and animals, and then you also have the hierarchy of humans are more important than other animals. So this belief means that when we say risks should be avoided at all costs, that what we mean is human risks should be avoided at all costs. Because if you look at those experiments, the risks for the mice and the monkeys were extremely high, you know, like almost guaranteed that they would die in the experiments. So it's not their risks that we want to avoid, it's our human risks. And then together, these beliefs lead to regulations requiring animal testing just in case. So for example, the requirement of the mouse bioassay, even though industry was saying, well, it has no added value. But also the inadequate budget, you know, specifically for the monkey cages, but also more generally for financing the 3 Rs. So now this iceberg model always raises the question, well, if those mental models are so important, does that mean that we have to change them and not the other layers of the iceberg? Or should we change the events and then hope it has a trickle-down effect? You know, what is the order? So changing mental models in order to change practices, or the other way around? And the answer is yes. So it's not one or the other. We are going to look now at a few examples of where things changed away from animal testing. These few, some smaller and a bigger case. And there you will see that sometimes it is a belief that changes and that then leads to a change in practice, but sometimes it's the other way around. Sometimes it's a little bit of both in an interaction. So the iceberg model is not saying that you should only work on the lower level. You should address all those levels, but not forget about the lower level, the mental model level, because that's a level that's often forgotten. So let's look at an example. This is also from the RIVM, so the National Institute of Public Health and Environment in the Netherlands. So they had those XPA mice. They weren't using them for carcinogenicity testing. That didn't work out. But their joining that international research program led to them also getting a grant for aging research in various strains of mice, actually. And they were financed by the NIH in the US for that program. And they were selected because they had a really nice animal house with enough space and also enough expertise to house a lot of different strains of mice, and also the expertise of laboratory animal science to take good care of them. They were really known for their laboratory science expertise and refinement expertise. And they were interested in aging, and they thought if we have different strains of transgenic mice, and maybe some of them will age faster, so that we can study aging faster than we would be able to in regular mice. So the XPA mice were also checked to see if they would be suitable, but then one of the mice lived to be 4 years old, so that's still quite a long time. So the XPA mice didn't age fast enough, but they used other transgenic mice that didn't live for that long. And one of the things they experimented with was caloric restriction. So if you have them on a lifelong restricted calorie diet, does that then increase their lifespan? Well, at a certain point, the funder said, okay, we don't want to fund your research anymore, because why are we sending our money to Europe? We're gonna just, ask you to send us some of the mice, and then we're gonna start up the program here in the US with our US money. So that ended the mice breeding program. It, by the way, didn't start up in the US. They didn't manage to get it off the ground. But they had to find a new approach to studying caloric restriction and aging. And what they did instead is they thought, well, what can we study now in humans? And they looked at short-term caloric restriction in humans, I think it was a few weeks or maybe even a few days before surgery, and then to see what effect it would have on the recovery. So the idea being that caloric restriction before the surgery would then lead to faster recovery after the surgery. And they already had the idea that it could work like that even before they started the mice aging research. So it's not that they got that idea from there. And of course, what they were doing with the mice lifelong caloric restriction is not something that you can do in human volunteers. I don't think anyone would sign up for a significant caloric restriction for their whole life. So that would also not be so relevant if no one is going to do it anyway. So what can we learn from this? So the driver was the budget cuts. There was no choice. It just happened that the funder said, we're not going to fund you anymore. But the result was more relevant research results, because this is something that you can actually do and help humans with. Because what they did with the mice, that would never be something that they would do with humans. Of course, no more mice used for the mice. That's really nice, and it saved money. So what we can learn from this, I think, is that in order to produce valuable research results on a certain issue, you don't have to find exact replacements of the animal experiments that you would otherwise do or that people have been doing. So if you think of the idea of replacement or alternative, if you still want to use it, then you can also broaden it to just think what is the actual issue. Let's say diabetes, just to give an example. Then you can also think just of everything that you can study from whatever discipline that would contribute to helping people with diabetes or to prevent people from getting diabetes, instead of a one-on-one copy of an experiment that you would do in animals. So they learned this lesson through a budget cut and not through a change in mental models. But if you reflect on that lesson, then it could lead to an adjustment of mental models, but that does require reflection. And I also saw that there was this reflection within this institute, and they were quite proud also to tell me that they switched to testing using human-based research and not animal research. But it also shows the importance of phasing out measures. So the budget cuts It sounds like something very negative, but it is also something that is needed to prompt change. And this could also be done through regulations. So it's not just stimulating new things, but also phasing out old ways of doing. Okay, let's go to the second example. And this is about an experiment with monkeys that was rejected. So the proposed experiment was an experiment with 6 monkeys. And these were, again, the monkeys sort of left over from the polio times, because they weren't used for polio anymore. And there was sort of the idea, well, what can we do with the monkeys now? And this was about Crohn's disease. And what they wanted to do is to see if there is a relation between MAP, so that's a mycobacterium that's found in cow's milk, and developing Crohn's disease. And they wanted for a long time to feed the monkeys cow's milk that was infected with this mycobacterium, and then high doses of this bacterium. The Animal Experiments Committee reviewed the experiment 3 times, and they rejected it every time for several reasons. One of the reasons was just the scientific quality of the experiment. They called it an aimed shot in the dark. And they also said, even if you were to do this with humans instead of monkeys, it still would not give you like valuable results, because it's so far removed from the real life situation, because the dosages were so high that it still wouldn't tell you anything about humans who actually have Crohn's disease. And the other reason was that they were quite critical because they were monkeys, and the experiment involved housing them in an isolator for a long time, and also catching them quite often, which was not only a welfare issue, but also a safety issue for the animal technicians that would have to go in and catch the monkeys. So the researchers had a choice after the 3 rejections. They could appeal to a national central committee, but then this would be published, I think somewhere on a government like website or somewhere, but it would get publicity. And then they didn't want this publicity, especially because monkeys is such a sensitive topic, more than mice, for example. So they didn't appeal. And instead, they conducted a literature review and concluded that research with human patients would be the best course of action. So you could, of course, wonder, well, why did they not do the literature review before they proposed the monkey experiment? So that can already be one lesson learned from this. But let's look at the drivers behind this change in course of action. Well, first there was the Animal Ethics Committee being critical about the scientific quality. But there were also, of course, the human attitudes towards monkeys and the fear of reputation damage following from that. So here you see that those mental models in society about specifically monkeys, not animals in general, played a role in affecting what happened in this case. And the result is, well, more relevant research, no monkeys used, money saved, and reputation damage avoided. Well, isn't that a great success? So what can we learn from that? Again, the same as in the last example, no need to find exact replacements of animal experiments. And especially not in this case, because they said, well, even if you do this with humans, it's not going to be relevant. And then also a rejection of an experiment does not necessarily hinder scientific progress, which could again lead to an adjustment of a mental model. And this also connects to discussions around legislation that I've seen in my research come up again and again. So each time legislation was proposed in the Netherlands, there was fierce resistance from scientists saying, oh, well, this will be a catastrophe for Dutch science and for public health, and all science will move abroad. And but then this never happens. And then the legislation was, after maybe a decade or so, also embraced and accepted by scientists themselves. But then there was a new adjustment of the legislation becoming stricter. And then again, there was first this resistance of, no, we don't want an animal ethics committee because it will be too much of a burden, and it will move science abroad, and it will be a disaster for public health in the Netherlands. And then now they embrace those animal ethics committee. So you see the same pattern every time. So it would be very nice if we now learned from this pattern that something that seems maybe threatening science, when you first encounter it, and you have this automatic resistance, but then maybe this is not necessarily the case, how it will turn out. So I see the same arguments in the current discussion about, moving away from animal science, saying, well, that this will also be a disaster for public health, but maybe not. If we look at the previous examples of legislation, this was not the case. Let's go to the final example. And this is more on the level of an institute, so what change can mean for an institute, maybe also for an individual researcher. So as I mentioned before, the RIVM was an expert on animal housing and laboratory animal science. That's why they were also given those funds for the mice research, for example. But then at a certain point, their vaccine production moves to another institute. And that was a big part of their animal research. And then they also had the policy of what they called de-animalization. So they also wanted to move away from animal testing. And as a result, they had fewer and fewer animals, and they were much less involved in animal testing. So that made it difficult to keep up their expertise in laboratory animal science and animal housing because they had so few animals. And then the issue for them was, well, then it's important for them to have these expert positions international. If we lose this position, what will it mean? But we cannot maintain it. And then they saw, well, we have an opportunity if we focus on 3 R's and alternatives and what is needed right now there in the international community, then there is a place for a new international leadership position, but focusing on alternatives and validation, implementation, policies. So there are all kinds of European working groups on 3 R's policies and implementation and validation. So they found a new international position. So this change was driven by just a change of task of the vaccine production moving elsewhere, but also the desire to de-animalize, which came from a concern about other animals. And especially specific individuals within those organizations were really driving that change. And then the result was a new opportunity for international leadership, but also research in alignment with values. So when I interviewed people there, they were always quite happy to inform me that in their department they were not doing animal testing at that moment anymore. Yeah, I think it just felt good for them. And then, so what we learned from this is that a paradigm shift also brings new opportunities. So it's not just stopping with doing old things, it also brings you things. And it also shows that a focus on phasing out and breaking down is crucial in transitions. So that was the final example. And now we will look at opportunities summarized. And I just want to say this is not an exhaustive list of all the opportunities and barriers and stuff out there. This is just some things that I identified from my historical research. And many of those are, of course, also in other studies, but I'm sure there are also other opportunities out there that can be added to the list. And so what we saw is it's not a matter of either changing practices or mental models, but it's both. And change can come from interactions of those or in different directions. Sometimes it's something like a budget cut that has nothing to do with values about animal testing that then can still lead to changing those practices and moving beyond animal testing. Within translation studies, they often distinguish 3 levels, so the niche level, the regime level, and the landscape level. And then the niche level, that's the sort of practice level where people are developing alternative testing models, like, say, organoids that they're trying to get mainstream. And then you have the regime level, that is where the regulations are and basically how it's going now, like the system, you could say. So the established way of doing things. And then above that you have the landscape level, and that's where more the mental models and the values in society at large are, so also the social movements. And both from the niche level and the landscape level you can put pressure and ideas towards the regime about change. So you could say that individual scientists are more on the changing practice level and trying to develop innovations and more free innovations. And then you have social movements and just citizens in general at the landscape level. And if you connect them, I think that can be a really strong force to push forward change in the regime. And I think a nice example is always NGOs and charities that fund animal-free research. So sometimes it's a charity for a specific disease or condition that then only funds animal-free research on helping people with that disease or finding a cure for that disease, for example. And of course, scientists can also be part of social movements. I think it's important to not forget that and to not have activism and science as opposed to one another, but rather see it as groups that cannot join forces or even be the same. Yeah, and we also saw that we need to not only build new ways of doing, but also break down old ways. So that means that the regulation government also need to come with phasing out plans with concrete goals and make sure they also allocate the right budget towards that. Yeah, and then if you want to have more involvement of the mental models and the landscape level, then it's important to bring in different perspectives from different disciplines, different parts of society, and to repoliticize and democratize animal testing so that it doesn't stay within a small biomedical science field, but that the discussion is opened up and you can have critical perspectives that can shed some light on where are these opportunities for change, what beliefs are we so stuck in that we don't even see that they are beliefs, but we think they are just truths. And yeah, open discussions up to the general public. And I've put here, public, do we mean just humans, or do we think of other animals also part of our democratic society? And that may seem a bit far-fetched to you, but I can tell you that within political philosophy, there's a lot of discussion going on now about democracy for non-human animals as well as humans. And you can also think a bit small in that sense about development, saying that like laboratory animals should be able to retire if they survive their time as a laboratory animal. So in the Netherlands, we have a lot of projects now where former laboratory animals, and not just the dogs, but also rodents, are able to retire and live in a nice cage and without any experiments in people's homes who adopt them. Yeah, and there's also a union for non-human animals that work in any way, so in in food production or in laboratories. And so you see a movement towards extending democratic practices towards other animals, and I'm very interested to see what that will mean for animal testing. And then 2 more things. I think we should remember to celebrate the success stories and also see what lessons we can learn from that and what they mean for our mental models. And we need to critically reflect on our own underlying beliefs and ask what are those beliefs. If you, let's say, you're working in animal testing, and think, what is it that you have been taught as a student, and what is it that you can do now to help the transition away from animal-free science. Because I see when I teach students from biology, for example, or pharmacy, that they've still been raised with this idea that animal testing, it's a necessary evil, so to say, but it's just there, like it's not a choice, but of course it is a choice. It has consequences, but it's still a choice. And I think that is a first step in changing those underlying beliefs and seeing that it is a choice and not something that we as humans are forced to do. So now I would like to ask you if you have any questions or if you have any success stories that you would like to share with the rest, or maybe you know of some more opportunities, or you have some beliefs of yourself that you would like to reflect on. All those things are welcome. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anne. That was very, very interesting. I also liked, your approach to your thesis, actually, or how your approach to your research, because you had a non-anthropocentric approach, and looked at the stories of the animals used in science. And I really like this multi-species approach, because I guess if we want to be a more just society, we have to include also the non-human humans amongst us more. And so that I thought was very interesting. And just because that might not be known by some of the listeners, Anne has a social sciences background, which gives her, a different approach, obviously, to such a research topic than if somebody had already gone through the school of, for example, studying biomedical sciences, where the approach to animal use is still different. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And there are some questions in the chat, which I will read to you, and then we can go from there. So there's one comment saying, what an amazing study. Thank you for this presentation. I totally agree. We need to have more interdisciplinary projects on non-animal research, where biomedical researchers work together with social scientists. Do you have any views to share on patients' mental model, how we offer them the opportunity to change their view that animal tests are needed for them to live?
Yes, thank you for the interesting question. I think with patients, I've spoken also to some people from patient organizations, and it's very interesting that there's a big difference between patient organizations, where some are really saying, oh, please don't have any more regulation on animal testing because we need animal testing. And others have actually said, oh, we're only going to fund animal-free methods. So I think it's good to be aware that there is a wide range of mental models already among those people. And I think what would help is not to create fear among those people, because of course they're a vulnerable group of people and worried about maybe themselves or their family members who they're representing in such organizations. So, and I've seen some visits of patient organizations to institutes where they do animal testing, and they were saying oh, the government is going to ban animal testing, and you should be really worried. So they were really promoting fear among those people. So I think that's a good example of what not to do. And I think instead have an open discussion of, yes, if we change our practices, it will change what sort of things we research, but it won't mean that we will stop researching solutions for illnesses, because that is often what is said, that as if we just stop animal testing and then do nothing. But of course, that is not what's going to happen. It's just that you're approaching things differently. And I think the sort of human biology, taking that as a starting point, is also very promising, especially for those diseases where there hasn't been any progress for a long time using animal testing. And I think if you put all those underlying values on the table, because it's not that they're a fan of animal testing. If they're saying that we want animal testing, there's something underneath that, which is a concern about their future or their family's future. And then let's talk about that and say that you understand that. And then I think do that first, talk about the values first in that case. Yeah, and share the success stories.
Mm-hmm. Another question is, what should we give priority to move towards replacement according to your experiences and research?
Replacement versus refinement or reduction, or within?
I understand the question as what kind of, which areas of research do you think are most pressing? That's how I understand this question. It's clear that we have to move towards non-animal human biology-based methods, but have you discovered anything in your research where you see, okay, this is a very pressing field?
No, I don't think I think it's all urgent, but the approach will be different for different types of research. So for regulatory research, of course, then it's the regulations that need to change. But for basic research, even individual researchers can already make a choice because they are not forced by regulations to conduct certain research. And I think actually education is a very important place to start, both like really young school children, but also specifically those that might go into animal testing, but that is a choice, presented as a choice and not something that you have to do or a necessity. So I think actually education is very crucial in this.
Yeah, it's very promising that the Joint Research Center of the European Commission actually has done a lot in this field, that they wanted to explain already starting at school age the 3 R's principles and why we are trying to move away from animal use in science. And it's true. I mean, if you only start when you're exposed to animal experiments during your university studies, it's quite late if you never thought about this before. And another thing, I don't know what you think about that, since you also are teaching now, I think it's just very important, as that was mentioned in the comment before, that we need interdisciplinary teaching also. And I think one big thing that we could definitely use more of is animal ethics courses and also bioethics courses, mandatory courses, I would say. I agree. Yeah, because I teach those courses like pharmaceutical humanities and bioethics for biology, but they're not mandatory courses. And then the students always say, oh, wow, these should be mandatory, and not just in the master's phase, but also in the bachelor phase. Yeah, because I think if you never address a problem and you don't teach critical thinking skills, that's another big thing that I was missing actually in veterinary medicine. You don't reflect upon things. You also mentioned that we should critically reflect on our own underlying beliefs. And I think, that's very important, because obviously everybody has their own biases, and it's important to assess them and move forward. Another question: why would a scientist that eats animals refrain from doing experiments on animals which may be necessary to find life-saving medications, whereas the eating animals is not necessarily important? That is what the person asks.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And it's also something that I hear quite a lot, and also something that I find quite fascinating myself is, why do we only have the no unless principle for animal testing? So you can only test on animals if there's no alternative, but we don't have it for any other use of animals. So it's not like, no, you cannot eat animals unless there is no alternative. Personally, I would say don't eat the animals. But I think there is definitely a different treatment of animal experimentation in society than other uses, which can be explained, quite easily psychologically, because eating animals is something that almost everyone does, and also almost every day, and it's seen as part of culture and identity, whereas animal experimentation is much less so. Most people don't think about animal experimentation, and I think scientists also would be happy to use alternative methods. So there's not this attachment to animal experimentation. Apart from, of course, maybe some people would find it difficult to then stop doing something and to acknowledge that it was not the right thing to do in the past, maybe. That can play a part in it, but I don't think you have to think about it like that in order to change in the future. It's not about judging people that were doing animal experimentation. I don't think that's a valuable way of looking at it. Yes, so why would they stop doing it? I think they would do it because you can say it's a necessity, maybe even if it would be a necessity for some human benefit, for the non-human benefit, it's a necessity that you don't do the experiment. And that is guaranteed, whereas your future benefit for humans is not even guaranteed. And there might be an alternative way to it. So from a, like what they call an interspecies justice perspective, there is not a justification for doing the animal experiment just because it might have a benefit for humans.
Yeah, and I think what we really need, because the way this question is asked, it sounds like the person does believe in the necessity of animal use in science. But as you mentioned before, I think if people learn more how to do literature reviews, we would also be better at assessing the benefit of what we're actually doing, because actually we could retrospectively assess all the animal experiments that have been done and then really know what was useful and what wasn't. And from the few retrospective assessments that are out there, you can actually see that the output is not as great. And there was, for example, this retrospective assessment by Pandora and Nicol from 2018 that showed very clearly that in retrospect, most of the animal experiments conducted were not justifiable from a scientific and from an ethical standpoint. And I think this is really like that we have to focus more on really assessing and doing a quality control of what's been done, and then just be unemotional about it and just move forward in the right direction. Because I don't know, I find it amazing that there are so many animal models still used where there's evidence, strong evidence that they are not useful, but they are still funded, they are still authorized by the competent authorities, and the research is still published. Before that doesn't change, I think we don't have this shift. And just to come back to your iceberg, the mental models seem to be the hardest and the strongest, right? When you look at they are the basis of the iceberg. So do you have more ideas, or what are your thoughts on change? You already mentioned education from an early age. What do you think can be done to change the laboratory animal science community to even acknowledge that there might be better, more useful, more human relevant models out there that we have to, of course, still further develop and so on. But do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's two different issues. One is changing the beliefs about science and the value of animal testing in that, and the other is the idea of humans being more important than other animals. And I think this is also in the wording that we use, because the words that we choose to use can be quite powerful. So if we keep speaking about necessity, that sort of stops the discussion, because, well, it's needed, so what can we do? But even if there were to be a benefit for humans from animal testing that we couldn't get otherwise, it's still not a necessity, it's still a choice, because it's So when you say necessity, it is based on the assumption already that it's justified to choose human interest over other animals' interests. And when you keep saying necessity, you keep making that assumption without making it explicit. So I think it also starts with making those assumptions explicit. And if you want to do that, then it's very important, what was mentioned already before, to invite those interdisciplinary scientists, because they can show you assumptions that you are not seeing yourself anymore if you have been in the sort of the same environment for a long time. And what I think is very interesting development in the Netherlands is that the Central Committee for Animal Testing now has regular meetings with also people from NGOs and even more activists like animal rights movement organizations. This is very recent, but I think we have to see what this leads to. But at least this is a good step in the direction of bringing in different perspectives. And I think this needs to happen a lot more.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to your thoughts on, how to include the public in this dialogue, because I think this is something that sometimes is forgotten. Of course, scientists are part of the public, but maybe we should really open up. Yeah, you talked about democratizing, I think you used the word, this process. And I think this is really true, because at the moment it seems like that the scientists are the ones that tell us what is right and what is wrong as a society. But as we can see from your case studies, it is clear that we might, the person being very convinced about their animal use in science might not really see all the problems with this thought culture, and so it would be very important to have a more open dialogue, obviously. And do you have any thoughts on how this can be done? Because at the moment I find that most of the discussions are quite, there seems to be two extremes, the people who don't want animals to be used, and they are often viewed as very emotional, whereas I wouldn't think that, because I think this is for everybody emotional, obviously, or also for the people who do animal experiments. So do you have any thoughts how this can be done in a better way, that there's a public dialogue, and how that could look like?
I see it sort of go wrong, like you're also describing. And then that has to do with, sometimes it comes down to a few experts having a very technical discussion about what is and what isn't possible, which the audience, the public, doesn't then understand. So don't do that. But what also happens is that you have people who work in animal experimentation saying, oh, those activists, they are just anthropomorphizing emotional, crazy people. And then the activists saying, oh, those people in animal experimentation, they are, like they like to torture animals in a basement somewhere, which is, of course, also ridiculous. So if you start with that, then it's never going to go anywhere. But actually, there are a lot of shared values, in the sense that everyone is trying to do what they think is best for society, and everyone, to a certain extent, also cares about animals. Even people who experiment on animals, they do care about those animals. And if you acknowledge those shared beliefs, and also acknowledge even the beliefs where you differ, but that come from similar values, then you have a much better basis for discussion. And if you think, you start in such a polarized, accusatory manner, then there's never going to be a discussion. And I know that in some countries, there's also experimentation with having lay people in ethics committees, for example. So that could also be something that is helpful. But I do agree with, coming back to an earlier comment, that it would be very strange to have the public be more sort of critical towards animal testing, or even just thinking about it more, and then not be more critical towards their own use of other animals. So I don't think you can change that without also changing more general human-animal relations within society. So you need to tackle that broadly, I think.
Yeah, that's actually really a good point, because it is kind of, sometimes I wonder about those polls, I think it always also depends how you ask questions, but in terms of animal experimentation, the majority of the public actually does not like that. But then you could also say, on the other hand, many don't reflect upon their daily use of animal products in their life, such as eating them, wearing them, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, that's definitely something that needs to be addressed. Together. So there's another question. In 2019, a motion was accepted in the Dutch parliament that asked the minister to look into how taking money away from animal testing to animal-free research could accelerate the transition. The company that studied this thought that this wouldn't help because the big bottleneck now is the lack of alternative methods. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I don't think it's the lack of alternative methods that is now the bottleneck. I don't think there is even just one bottleneck. And even if it was, then you could use the money to develop those. But if you think about what part of animal research is done that is not demanded by law, then that is like maybe 75% or something. It might differ between 70-75%, and that is all research where you can make choices. No one is forcing you to use animal methods. So then you may not have a one-on-one replacement, but as we saw in the examples, you don't need to have a one-on-one replacement to have valuable research results. So you could either research something different that's valuable, or you can go look for that one-on-one replacement alternative if you are thinking that is absolutely necessary. And then if there's money for that would be great. But I haven't read the article that they're referring to. So I'm not sure what the argument was, but just based on that one question, that is how I think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also don't think, I think, of course, we are in a kind of a vicious cycle at the moment, because I don't think we have many early career scientists who are actually trained in the non-animal approaches, and that of course is all like, there's not a lot of funding for this field of research. There's not enough universities offering programs that are completely focused on the new approach methodologies. Then there's obviously, it's harder to publish your data. So it seems to be, it's a vicious cycle, but I think you can obviously, by improving all those things, by having more educational programs for those people, by funding them better, by supporting them better, by changing the publishers. There are now, there are initiatives that push for, that of course data is accepted, even so it's animal-free data and things like that. So I think we are moving forward, but too slow. So obviously I think we have to address all those areas to really make a difference. And I don't think from the huge, I would say, compared to how much money is going into the new approach methodologies, the output is quite promising. So I can just tell you from my own experience now, we had 2 awards, one for an early career scientist and one for an ongoing project. And I would have loved to fund all the ongoing projects and all the early career scientist proposals we received, because they were all outstanding. So that was, we didn't get hundreds and hundreds of proposals, but the ones we got were really promising. And I just hope that they do get the funding they need. So yeah, I think that shouldn't be the problem, that there isn't enough smart people out there who could move this field of research forward, which will definitely be more promising than other species that don't reflect human biology. There's another question from the US. Here in the US, revenue source for our public and private universities is securing research grants from public agencies such as the NIH. Ideas of approaching NIH to consider is the question. For example, offering grants which allow animal and non-animal basic research grants. Anyone from the IH on this call, she asks if you can respond to her question. So maybe it's more to the other people in the audience, but maybe you have some thoughts on that as well. How do we have to change our funding schemes to make it easier for the animal-free approaches to be funded?
Yeah, I think here is something where it would be great if you have like a sort of landscapes, like a social movement, collaborate with scientists together, saying to a funder, hey, as a society, we want you to focus more funding towards animal-free research. And then as a scientist saying, hey, we can do really valuable things with that money, so that you show not just the pressure, but also the opportunity of what can then happen with that money. So if you would have some sort of collective action between scientists and social movement, specifically targeted at getting a certain fund, I think that would be really something that could work, that would be fruitful, because I think such funding bodies are also sensitive to their public reputation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a look at, because for NIH you can see who is in the committees. You have different disease areas, for example, and then you can see who is assessing the proposals. What I thought was quite interesting, that in many of those committees there are a lot of animal researchers in there. So obviously it's not surprising that those would then fund their peers with the same model. So I don't know how to break this system, if we just have to, just in general redeploy the funding that is now available for animal experimentation, because I just, obviously in every country, especially now during COVID, you have a shortage of funding, you should have a shortage of money in general. But the money is still there. It's just used for something that maybe is not the best. It's not the best, but that is kind of the thing that we have to try to redeploy the funding to the new approach methodologies that are human biology based. Did you think that publishing negative results in animal models could help to improve the 3R strategy at the universities?
I think, I'm not sure if it's specifically at universities, but I think publishing negative results is a good idea in general, not just for animal testing, but of course it can prevent repetition. And then people, getting the same negative results. But also I think just for science in general, if you share things we can also learn from negative results, also in non-biomedical fields. So yeah, definitely. I think that there is also, I don't know if this is a Dutch thing, but like a journal for negative results studies. Yeah.
Yeah, and another thing is that we have now the pre-registration platforms where you can publish. You should put your data in there, so at least it's clear that the study has been done. And of course, I think some people don't like when something is mandatory, but I think sometimes that's the only way. Thinking of, you got money from somebody, if it's taxpayers' money or some other grant from somewhere, you should be you should send a report and this should be published somehow. I don't understand why it's so difficult to just, request this, because thinking about all the problems we have in science, starting with the quality, that it's not reported correctly what's actually been done and such and such. I think the only way forward is to say, okay, you have to use a certain, set of guidelines, and you have to follow those and report everything, and it has to be publicly available, because when you claim that your science is for the public, you should be also required to publish. It's kind of, I don't know, I don't understand why that is such a difficult topic. Another question, I was impressed by your 2 positive examples how replacement improved research. However, would your approach also have discovered negative examples? That means research that was weakened or even disrupted by replacement. Did you come across that in your research?
No, I didn't. But of course, my research is it's historical research of certain cases, so it's not a representative, researching everything that was done in the Netherlands in that time period, for example. But I think because people are quite hesitant to go towards replacement unless they're absolutely certain that the alternative is at least as good as the animal test, that it's quite rare to find it the other way around. And here it was more sort of by outside force that they had to change, and then were surprised. Yeah.
So one comment in here says there's a special funding call in the Netherlands on animal-free safety assessment, also asking for interdisciplinary research, including social sciences. So that's really promising, actually. Yep. I'm very excited about this. And we had several more comments, but it looks like our participants also discussed with each other, which is great. That's actually why we are having a meeting and not a webinar, so everybody can really benefit from the others in the audience as well. So I hope I went through most of the questions now. So my question to you is, what was, when you worked several years on this, what was the biggest surprise for you? I guess you had some thoughts about what you are getting yourself into with doing this research. Was there something you were really surprised about, something unexpected?
Well, I think I was sort of expecting the sort of things I found, but what I was surprised about, for example, with the mouse case, that they developed it and then didn't use it, that it was totally fine that happened. So that it was not like something, I really don't want to talk about it, because that was really sort of a bad thing that we used all those mice and it didn't really lead to anything. So I think I was a bit surprised about that it was just sort of normal part of business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you have any thoughts on how we can establish this interspecies justice model, that we include other animals in our society that are actually already part of our society, but they are not regarded as they probably should? Do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think it's quite far removed from where we are now, so it will take a lot of changes on a lot of things, but there have been some guidelines written by Bledner and others about how research with other animals would look like based on informed consent and principles like that. So for research, I think that would be very interesting. Of course, that would rule out invasive biomedical research, but it doesn't rule out all research, because if we say no research at all in any way, shape, or form, then we as humans are still determining that for other animals. Mm-hmm. And I do see a lot of small practices being set up, and also in the rights area, you have rights for rivers, for example. So you can also non-human rights. So I think there are a lot of small developments that are really implying big changes. And one thing that we are doing in the research project that I am working in now, this is a big consortium researching the food transitions, so different topic, but also involving animals, is to find representation of what we call marginalized stakeholders. So stakeholders that don't approach us, that aren't organized and influence our research directly, and find a way to include them to critically look at our research and our questions and our methods. And so those can be animal advocacy groups, or also like a children's council representing future generations. So to also democratize the way we do research, to include vulnerable groups in society, including other animals.
Yeah, maybe one last question, since we have 1 minute left. What is missing in the current approach to move away from animal testing in the Netherlands? What are your thoughts on that?
What is missing is more focus on phasing out and breaking down old ways, and not just building up new ways and actual targets. And what is missing is a reflection on underlying beliefs that underlie the idea of necessity, because there is still this anthropocentric position that in no way can we put, non-human animal interests at the same level as human interests. It's always still human interests prevail over other animals' interests, and that is not really reflected upon.
Yeah, I totally agree. Also with your first point, it seems like there are two developments there in parallel. The animal experimentation is continuing, and then the new approaches are developing, but it's not, they are not, the animal experiments are not being reduced. You can see in the numbers that there's really no reduction. So we have to, start doing that as well. And there was one other question about what we briefly touched on, the problem that oftentimes in papers, they then want animal data to compare with. Actually, that is a big problem that has been addressed recently, and there's also a working group on that. I could give some more information on that. We recently also had an early career scientist workshop where we addressed this topic, and we will actually post this session on our YouTube channel for everybody interested. I hope before Christmas, so I can send in the follow-up email. I can send you the link to the YouTube channel, and you can have a look at this, because this is a big topic, obviously, in making a change and moving away. Because if we agreed upon that some of or most of the animal models are actually not producing the results we are hoping for, that they are translatable to humans, then why should we compare the new models that are human biology based with those not so useful old models? So Anne, thank you so much for your time tonight. This was very, very great, and I really enjoyed reading your thesis. I can highly recommend it. And yeah, thanks a lot for diving into this research topic, because I think your expertise as a social scientist is very important and eye-opening. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you're doing in your new project, which also sounds very exciting to me. And I hope we stay in touch, and maybe we can have you in another webinar on your new current project, because we also do, we start next year a series on evidence-based animal protection research, and I think that would be fitting there.
Yes.
So thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you, and have a good rest of your day or evening, depending where you tuned in from. And I hope to see you all soon. Our series will continue at the end of January, and I will post more information on that very soon. Anne, thank you very much. Thanks everybody for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon.